Hello and welcome to Nerdarchy. For nerds, by nerds, I'm Nerdarchy Dave. Today I'm joined by Norman Rafferty from Sanguine Games. How are you doing today?
I'm not unwell, thank you. How are you doing today?
Awesome. It's good that you're not unwell. So if you'd be so kind to kind of introduce yourself and a little bit about what you do.
Well, I'm Norman Rafferty. I'm the art director for Sanguine Games. I'm one of the founding members. Since 1999, we published our flagship tabletop RPG, Ironclaw, anthropomorphic fantasy roleplay. And since then, we've done several books. We've we are the we've had I think we're up to our 18th successful crowdfunding. Thank you for your support. We make a variety of indie games. We make Myriad Song and Farflung, which are science fiction games. We make Bleeding Edge, which is a cyberpunk game. Urban Jungle. We recently made Usagi Yojimbo, which is a 17th century samurai game. We make a lot of crazy stuff. And thanks for having me on the show today.
You're very, very welcome. Do you have a favorite?
Oh, I love all my children. Myriad Song was a passion project for us, which is a love letter to what's called new wave science fiction from the 70s and the 80s. The things like Valerian and Kaza and Lone Sloan, the things that inspired Star Wars, that kind of era. And I have a fondness for that because I have a fondness for specific genres. But no, I all the games I work on are games I love to play.
Do you is there any genres you guys haven't covered? Because it seems like you've run the gambit, looking at your website.
Well, Abyss is our latest project, and that is supernatural, superheroic role playing. And there we talk about some of our holy grails of design and superhero role playing. That is where people are very powerful characters, like you see in shoujo anime, and that sort of thing. Has been something that we've only like briefly delved into. A lot of game masters get this idea that if you're not killing your players every third session or
Mhm.
whatever, they're not being challenged. And so also there were a lot of I promised I'd be nice. So I think there's a lot of games out there that don't quite get it. And they'll often, like, people will say, well, we have to play this kind of game because it's the only kind of game that's like this. And so there's a couple of genres that we're reaching into, and superhero is one where pretty every most of the role playing games that are in it kind of were falling a little flat. So that's what I'm excited to be publishing it, because we think we can finally present it in a way that everyone at the table is going to have fun with.
Okay. I mean, there's a few that I've played that I've enjoyed. What is it you think that they don't get like about that genre?
Well, I'm going to say exception to this, but there used to just be two. The real big problem is a lot of superhero games were, to quote Armor Gideon, one of my favorite authors, Armageddon Time. People didn't know if they liked superheroes or calculus more. And so you get these games that were really complicated or had lots of point buy systems. And
Yeah.
that's not what superheroes are. They're not a bag of superpowers with a lot of accounting limits on them. It's like people don't think of Deadpool or Logan or Spider-Man as a bag of powers. They think of them as, they're strong, they can move fast, they are good with a bow, they can get angry. They think of them as a few things that they're really, really good at. And a lot of the hardcore superhero games were having people buy things with points
Yes.
and making it a meticulous war game. So you wound up with people with like 20 or 30 sets of powers, which, you know, makes it fall into chaos because everyone's limited by certain numbers, so no one can go crazy, but everyone can do everything, which is what every GM actually hates. And also the genres were pretty limited for the most part. You either had people who were stuck in the 80s and just wanted to do X-Men over and over and over again when we haven't done that for 40 years, or they wanted to be martial law and Judge Dredd, where, oh, it's all grim and gritty, this isn't your dad superhero comic, and just want to murder stuff, in which case you're pretty much in some kind of cyberpunk game where you're just murdering things and you might as well just be playing D&D or Warhammer. Now, the reason why I say exception is because Masks is popular now. We've been streaming that over on Ractus. And do we stream that on Ractus? Well, maybe streaming somewhere else. I apologize, Ractus. The Masks is more in the Teen Titans mold, and it was more about like being immediate in your powers. So we're starting to see people branch out of that. But I mean, like there's a couple of these games that there's a couple genres that I don't know, gamers seem to have in their heads that they can't be very flexible. And we're seeing that shattered. Like I'm an old enough veteran to see when Vampire the Masquerade showed up and told people, look, nothing but vampires. Nothing but vampires. What kind of vampire are you? What powers you have? What society is? We're going to society, all that. And it was just nothing but that. And somehow they made a huge popular game out of it with lots of cool stuff to do out of what is at its core a very limited premise. So, and that's why we're angry indie people, because we want to, push
Shatter
the envelope.
expectations.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. Like I am a huge fan of testing preconceived notions, because a lot of times what we find out is they're actually false, right? And you don't really know until you poke at them a little bit and see if they hold up. Whether you're talking about games or just life in general.
Well, I mean, yeah, there's a weird paradox going on where someone might say, well, we should play Dungeons and Dragons, and someone say, well, what's that like? And let's say, well, it's like fantasy, like Lord of the Rings. And and Lord of the Rings, that's a billion-dollar franchise of movies that I've seen. So I'll be able to hold a sword, cast spells, and wrestle a Balrog into a pit? Well, no, that's not how wizards work.
Yeah.
And by the way, our elves are shorter, and like suddenly you run into these expectations. Or like, what about fantasy? You mean like Harry Potter? Lots of people have read Harry Potter and enjoyed Harry Potter. Well, no, D&D is not like that. Their elves are not slaves who live in your house, and we don't have those problematic elements. We've got different ones. You're basically just a guy who wanders around and kills for money, et cetera, et cetera. In other words, like there's all this stuff that the word fantasy can mean Game of Thrones, Redwall, time. It can mean the word fantasy can mean all these big broad genres, or like Final Fantasy 14, all this stuff that is so cool and wild. But then you get to the gaming table and people say, okay, we have to specifically make all of you low-level mercenaries who kill for money and can die in one hit. It's got to be this. And it's weird that there's an expectation that our role-playing games should not be like anything else that we enjoy. They should be an extremely narrow, unique experience, and we're fighting against that.
That's my issue with the D&D movie, is like to make it a fantasy movie is not really D&D, because D&D is not that necessarily, right? It's a bunch of other things.
Well, they immediately jumped into, like, the D&D movie immediately jumps into Campbellian eugenics. Ugh. Because like immediately it said, okay, wizards are a separate race of people. Like the mages have for a long time ruled all of you. And it's like, that's not from Dragonlance. That's not from Forgotten Realms. That's not from Mystara. That's not from anything. That's not in the text of the books.
Yeah.
It was, they felt like they had to invent all of that. Otherwise people wouldn't know what was going on. And whether that's valid or not, it's like, it does solidify what you just said, which was the people who made the movie, who were Dungeons and Dragons fans themselves, thought that the concepts of Dungeons and Dragons weren't something you'd enjoy watching as a movie, which is really weird because, as we were talking slightly before this podcast, obviously people enjoy Critical Role and Harmon Quest and Will Wheaton's Tabletop and Dimension 20. Obviously people enjoy stories like that. What was the failing of this media that they couldn't do that? But that's like a different discussion.
It is a whole huge discussion of its own. How did you get into RPGs? What was your entry point?
Like many people with as much gray hair as me, my entry was the Moldvay basic set of Dungeons and Dragons, the one with the Arrow Lotus cover, back when it was like a red box set, the original red box set. And it was pretty exciting. And then after that, I was branching out into stuff like Gamma World, RuneQuest, Rollmaster. Yeah. No, I was hardcore. I played a lot of different games over the years.
And so you've been a game designer for a long time. What was that transition like 20 years ago?
Well, I do a panel on how to self-publish, and believe it or not, back in the 90s, it was hard to get a game out because Amazon didn't exist yet. I want you to imagine a world before Amazon.
Yeah.
We didn't have broadband internet. Books were expensive and had to be stored, and there was only like one distributor handling all of this because the distribution wars had happened in the early 90s.
I'm
Thanks, Comic.
picturing a busted down mule and a wagon full of books.
Um, yeah, and the castle where they ignore your calls
Yes.
because the distributors were ignoring. But no, we set up our own network. We had a lot of support from Wizards Attic. Shout out to Atlas Games, who are still publishing. They were one of our early supporters, in Studio 2. But no, a bunch of us got together and got a business plan together, and we we were unhappy with the gaming climate out there and thought that we had ideas to bring to the table. But I have to emphasize this. Sometimes you'll hear people talk about heartbreaker games, which are where someone saw D&D and decided D&D wasn't complicated enough or didn't have hit location charts or whatever, and made their own version of D&D, but like, edgier or goofier or something that they really wanted, and published that. And we weren't about that. We were about there were kinds of games that we wanted to play. Like we wanted to do anime themed fantasy. We had seen Berserk or Record of Lotus Wars and seen that kind of cool action jumping swordplay, which wasn't what you were seeing in the tabletop games. Tabletop games were still in that Sierra Online mode of one hit, one kill, and full of all this, like you just blunder into traps and die horribly. They weren't, all that extraordinary moves and stuff that doesn't show up till D&D third edition, doesn't show up till like 2000. So we wanted to make a game that was themed like that. And so we also wanted to write it in a way that was accessible to people. That's the other thing I always emphasize. Is like, if you write a game that's only for people who already play games, you're only going to get people who already play games to play yours. You have to spend some moment and think about what would a new person who hadn't seen anything. That's why I mentioned the vampire game, because the vampire role-playing game, was a huge splash success, and it wasn't written in such a way of, okay, you already played D&D, now play this, or you've already played a war game, now let's play this. It was written to be accessible to new people who had no preconceptions about what it was about.
You kind of just hit on something I've been talking about for a while with licensing. And I'm always like, the problem with licensing is like, I never feel like you're actually reaching the audience of the property. You're just getting gamers that like that property, or which seems like a terrible way to do it, because licensing is expensive. And then to spend a bunch of money to not really take advantage of the thing you've acquired the rights to.
Well, it's both expensive and cheap, because on the one hand, it sounds expensive because you have to pay for the license. But on the other hand, with the license, you get all of the intellectual property. Like when Crucible licenses Doctor Who, they get stills from the TV show and all that lore. That stuff they didn't have to write or illustrate themselves. They just take all of that and put that in the book. So on the one hand, it costs them money to get it. On the other hand, look at all this stuff that we got, and it comes with a pre-built audience. And I will agree that licensing has the problem that I think some properties adapt better than others. Like Doctor Who is very freewheeling and crazy. So a Doctor Who role-playing game works a little bit better because there's a tradition of, well, the Doctor changes every now and then. So you can have your own Time Lord and your own companions, and you can build your own characters and have your own adventures. I think you run into a huge problem with, Star Wars is my big bugaboo, because every time I try to play a Star Wars role-playing game, everybody at the tables brought their own favorite Star Wars lore. And the designs of the games have problems modeling the Jedi. And then you'll get into arguments about, what should a Jedi be able to do, or what should,
Who can be a Jedi?
Maybe they shouldn't even be in the game. That's a surprising one to me, where people say like, hey, if I saw Star Wars and I saw, Anakin Skywalker or Luke Skywalker, or Rey throwing a lightsaber around, that looks really cool. Everyone's fantasy throw a lightsaber around. If I came to the table and you told me, well, you can't have a lightsaber, the rules for that are too broken, or it doesn't work right, you'll be too imbalanced and it won't be fun. It's like, that's a weird phrase. I thought having a lightsaber would be fun, and now I'm at the table. Yeah, that's a problem, I think, with franchise heavy. It's this weird paradox where Dungeons and Dragons is generic in that it can be any fantasy you want. By the way, it's pretty much just Forgotten Realms.
Yeah, unfortunately. So we often, these requests, people are dying for Greyhawk and Dragonlance, like the most vanilla settings that have been put out there. So tell me about is it Ironclaw?
Ironclaw.
Tell me about Ironclaw. I know nothing
Well,
about it. Educate me, please.
some people have described it as Game of Thrones meets Redwall. So Ironclaw is an anthropomorphic fantasy game where people play like rat people or cat people or bat people or dog people or some sort of weird species. And it's a fantasy world that's filled with dozens of different kinds of species that you can play. And people compare it to Game of Thrones because there's a political situation going on where there is a city whose nobles are basically dying out. And so the free people run this, the commoners run this. And they say, this city is great. We should keep this forever. But they're surrounded by kingdoms on each side that represent different aspects of the medieval world. Because there's the Avertapla, who are chivalrous horses, who believe in might makes right. There's the pagan Doloro, who of course have mysterious darkness and all the horrible things that come with pagan, and they're scary boar people. And the Bisclave wolves, who are very angry about modernism and they want to use bombs and cannons and everything Tolkien was afraid of. And these form very large power blocks in the world. And you take on the role of one of the adventurers that, because you don't necessarily have any ties. So this is where we want to challenge a lot of stuff about D&D. D&D makes you some kind of roving mercenary and assumes there's a world that exists around you. But then they're kind of vague about it, where it's Greco-Roman and there's dragons coming back and all this stuff. And I don't know. We wanted something that was a little more complicated than that. Like I don't know if you're familiar with the Redwall series.
Vaguely, but no, I have not read it.
Okay. I mean, Redwall's not even that complicated, but Redwall is about evil people want to enslave you and make you do work, and the good people don't want to be enslaved. That was easy.
Yeah.
And so we escalated from that premise and then made a world that was filled with characters, because like we said, we were fans of Berserk and Lotus War, and when people talk about their favorite anime, they're always talking about their favorite characters and how multidimensional the struggles are. I mean, like Full Metal Alchemist is a more recent one, and people, the bad guys are clearly bad, but they're the people that they hurt. Some bad guys show up that have clearly been wrong. They've experienced genocide or other forms of abuse, which has turned them into these forces of destruction. But you can't just take them head on, because you need to confront the issues they're related to. Like anime stuff was really complex like that. So we want to tell those same kinds of stories where, not everyone who is against you is your enemy, and not everyone who supports you is your friend. And we also wanted to make it fun and crazy. Like one of the advantages of making it crazy animal people was that people could had expectations, but not in stone. It's like D&D's elves are not the same as Tolkien's elves, which are not the same as Shannara's elves. When you say the word elf, we don't know what that means. Is that like Dobbin? Is that my house elf?
Yeah.
But when you say someone's a cat person, they say, okay, well, I can see in the dark and claw things, and I guess choke up hairballs. And they're like, yep, and you can do all that. You want to fly? There's bat people
And they might have goods for you, possibly
if you have coin.
Yeah.
Right, but I mean, it was pretty easy for people to say, like, if people showed up and didn't know anything, you said, well, can I play a horse person? They wouldn't be surprised. Wow, I'm big and strong and run fast. No one was surprised by any of this, and they could make the characters extremely quickly and get abilities and get in there and start playing.
Now that's the oldest game you guys have done. Is that correct?
Yeah. Ironclaw was our first game. We then took what we learned from that and made Myriad Song, which is a new wave science fiction game that's largely inspired by, somebody had to see Valerian, right? Did you see the Valerian movie? Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like the Valerian movie. I could see where people didn't. But that's from that era of heavy metal fantasy where we went and got some of the 70s and 80s cartoonists, like Carl Critchlow did a lot of Warhammer work, and Matt Howarth is one of my favorites. Jeff D, who did a lot of old D&D stuff and some sci-fi stuff. We got those artists to go ahead and draw, and we made, we wanted to make a sci-fi game that, once again, getting away kind of from the franchises. We wanted the game to be open enough worlds so you could make up your own opinions on it, but also make it simple and immediate enough so you could get in there. And we put in, we gave people crazy aliens out. Like that's kind of a frustration with modern sci-fi gaming, is like you show up at the table and they're still giving you humans are funny looking humans. They're afraid to let you just play a robot. Like they're afraid to let you do that because, oh my God, you can't breathe and don't age. That's totally broken the game.
Do you use the same system for those games, or do you have individual systems?
The Ironclaw, Myriad Song, and Urban Jungle line use the Cardinal engine, which is an engine we made ourselves, where you roll funny shaped dice. And I roll my funny shaped dice, you roll yours, and whoever has the highest number wins. It's a lot of people compare it to Savage Worlds, but it's a little different because Savage Worlds doesn't mix and match dice as much as we do. So it's a little crazy like that. That's the Cardinal engine. And we've also published in some other engines. We've done a D20 game, and we've done a couple Powered by the Apocalypse games.
Do you have a preferred system?
I'm fond of saying there is no unified system. I've enjoyed working with Powered by the Apocalypse because it has immediacy. It's very easy for people to just start playing. And like I got into gaming because I love complicated systems. I love stuff like, the old GURPS and Hero System and Rollmaster and that sort of thing. But there were problems with that because you could only play those with other people who also knew those games. Because if other people aren't playing the same complicated game you are, then you're just hand waving and doing fiat. You might as well, be playing anything. And, so that kind of defeats the point of playing.
I also grew up on the more complex systems, but I find as I get older, like I definitely lean towards more rules light. And also I do enjoy just the actual benefit of getting more people into the hobby and new players and being like, instead of going, oh, you want to do something really fun? Read this 400-page book and then let's have fun. Instead of being like, just fill out this thing, write this one page here, check some boxes, let's play a game.
I would suggest, I think the real problem is a lack of compartmentalization. For example, like Yu-Gi-Oh, Pokemon, and Magic the Gathering are still things today. People still play Magic the Gathering.
Yeah.
Magic the Gathering is an incredibly complex game. But the people who wrote Magic the Gathering from day one realized that what they needed to do was slowly introduce the complexity. It's like, okay, you need land to get these symbols. When you get these symbols, you can buy these cards. Start slow. That's the basic. Now you can get all these complicated things and moving parts that manipulate on top of each other, but it starts very core simple and people are patient and will explain it to you. And the rules are written in a way to be immediate. We have keywords that when you look them up, what does trample mean? It's over here. What does menacing mean? It's over here. They write it in a very clear language designed to be very simple and get people into it. And I think that's the real problem, I think, with a lot of games that they, like you said, they want to drop a 400-page brick of rules on your head and say you have to know everything in this.
Yeah.
Like one of the big appeals behind Power by the Apocalypse was that you needed to roll 2 dice and they listed on your sheet. And that was one of our goals with Ironclaw and our Cardinal games, was the idea that you wouldn't have to learn all of the rules, that if you were going to play if you just wanted to play the game casually, you could just put your points in cat or put your points in mercenary, and you're good at cat stuff, you're good at mercenary stuff, we're done. You don't have to buy any weird special abilities or learn out of this stuff. You could just win the game through sheer raw number power. And we were pretty successful at that. I think that I think that's what makes our games pretty popular, is that it's that idea of you have to keep the new person in mind. I think that's what scares a lot of people off with gaming, and that's an issue. I mean, I personally have a lot of games out there. I don't think they're simple enough at the beginning, but they could still. People love it when you pull off those. People love watching Hearthstone and watching that 8-minute animation happen of all the cards tripping all of at once and blowing up. People do enjoy playing a role-playing game and watching, all 4 or 5 of their special abilities all trip at once. The people love it watching Naruto, or I know I always pronounce that wrong. They love watching these animes of, aha, you've fallen right into my trap, because since I did the Hitsu Satsu Jitsu mode, you've actually tripped the entire matrix, and now the eponym shadows will devour your soul. people love that kind of, wheels within wheels Xanatos gambits. And saying that people don't want that at the gaming table, I think, is a misnomer. The trick is we have to somehow get them from this is dice and how you roll them, the simple stuff,
Yeah.
to the complex stuff over time.
Now, and it can be done with almost any game. It's just some games do it better than others, right? And you make very valid points. Like even in my own like D&D game with a new player, they're like, I want to do this, and even though none of it was optimum, I just said, okay, that's fine, and just tell me what you want to do as we play. And then as they play, they learn. They're like, oh, I didn't build my character right per se. And they're like, can I respec? And I'm like, sure. And they were so excited when they realized, when they line things up right. But the game itself doesn't do that for you. And that's kind of one of the issues that it sounds like you're kind of addressing with, like, yes, you can be more complex, but if you sequence it right, you can bring them along instead of having to have them know everything all at once.
Oh, I think one of the big dangers of role-playing games is they'll often talk about the good GM, which is a good GM can make any game fun or something like that. And there's an expectation that if the rules aren't working for you, no game can be written with everyone in mind, but you could get a good game master who will be able to help make it work for you. And that's a loaded statement because it's basically saying, so really, we don't need a rule book, do we? We could just have a good GM, and a good GM could just make stuff up that was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
And we don't really need this here, do we? So we need to go by the complete Marshall Handbook or Player's Handbook 3 or whatever, all these rules in it, because we could just make this up. It's like, well, no, you actually need all those rules. In other words, like there's the dual thing that the designers are selling you, which is the idea that you need lots of rules. By the way, if they don't work, change them. And that right there is a toxic ideology. It's kind of like the people, who are writing the rules need to understand that other people will take those rules at face value or try to use those. And I think that that's a huge obstacle in gaming, that there's all this rules that come out there, but they don't expect them to be any good. And that's where a lot of arguments and stuff come from. I think there needs to be spent more time, like as you watch the future of gaming and see more stuff like, Matt Mercer, Critical Role, and that sort of thing. We need to talk more about what is Matt Mercer doing up there that makes him a good game master. What, that makes his game fun and people are enjoying. And we need to put stuff like that in the book and talk to people rather than just telling them, well, if the game was no fun, just blame your GM. It was all their fault.
Yeah. I think it's a little bit easier when you come from gaming from years and years ago, because the games were new, and there were definitely parts that didn't work very well. So when they're like, you're the GM, you just need to fix it so it works for your game. Like, and you kind of had to, right, with first edition and second edition. So for us, we're like used to doing that, whether that's the way it should be or not. But new players, like you said, like they get the rules and they're like, the rules say they want to do it just like that, right? Because you always see them asking online, can I do this in my game? I'm like, you don't really have to ask anyone. You can just do it.
Yeah, it's your GM matters. No, in fact, one of the reasons why we got into gaming was what I like to call the Elminster Rule. Where if you're familiar with Forgotten Realms and D&D, every version of D&D, for some reason, every version of D&D has aging rules in it, because that's what everyone wants. We want to know when your character dies of old age. It's important to them to have at least a page devoted to, this is how you die of old age. And so eventually you will die, unless a god interferes or something. And then Elminster. Elminster shows up and he's hundreds of years old and has access to all these cool spells and has +10 to his constitution for some reason. Like, where'd this guy come from? It's like, oh, Elminster has a goddess friend who gives him benefits. But if you were to turn to your GM and say, well, I would like to play Elminster, I would like to have goddess benefits, your game master would say, well, no, there's no rules for that. There's no provisions for that in the game, and it would unbalance it. So in other words, here's one of the heroes of the setting, who's a cool character, and if you read the books, he's really important, that kind of stuff. But you will never be allowed to play that. And he's one of the canon examples that we have of that. Because there's other characters like Drizzt, who's also popular. His build is impossible. It was impossible in the rules. And there's a Legend of the Five Rings character, I forget his name, but one of the books in Legend of Fire Ring, so you can't build. In other words, we were getting annoyed that people were saying, like, here are all these characters who are really cool. By the way, the rules specifically prohibit you from being this person. Like, if you walked up to a random GM and said, I wanted to be Elminster, they would tell you no. And that's what got us angry about a lot of these games, because now we're back into that good GM theory. It's like the stories, like the official D&D books say these characters are cool, but I got to my table and my GM said I wasn't allowed to be this. What's going on here? And we blame the rule books, because it was like, you know, if this is the official rules, why can't you do the stuff that the official, you know, characters and stories, like you said with lore, why can't we do all of this? And so that's we came out, you know, our games always had the policy that it's like, no, you know, if someone can do it, you can do it. It might be hard, it might cost a lot of points, it might cost devotion, but we never specifically deny it to you. And everything you see other people doing is stuff you could do too. So learning the rules and understanding how the world works makes the world feel more real and more fun for you. And you know, that's always been our goal, and that hasn't always been the goal at the gaming table. Like, you go back to a lot of these old school games, and there's all these impossible characters with impossibly cool stuff, with, you know, or rule bending or breaking in their favor that you just weren't allowed to do. And we always thought that was a terrible message to send to the players.
Everyone kind of sidestepped that a little bit by going, we're just not going to have any of those Uber characters in our world. We expect the players to eventually be those Uber characters. So switching gears a little bit, Brian wants to know best art in the hobby currently.
Best art in the gotta
put you on the spot.
You know, I don't like to pick that. Also, by the way, I'm an old person. I come from the era of Wayne Reynolds.
Do you have a personal favorite? Let's go with your favorite instead of best. Best is subjective anyway.
My favorite artist. Well, I work with Matt Howard, so my favorite artist that I don't work with, would have to be Errol Otis, and Errol Otis I don't think works in the tabletop field, at least not that much anymore. He went on to video games like Star Control, mostly because, like I said earlier, with stuff like Myriad Song and other fantasy, before all the rules were set. I mean, as much as I respect artists like Wayne Reynolds and some of the artists that came behind them, nowadays, when you look at a lot of fantasy artwork, they're all like, okay, everything's gonna be made of triangles, everything's gonna be overlapping. Everyone has to have a coolly defined silhouette, like they're an MMO character. And a lot of it, while it's technically proficient, also looks very samey. Everyone's going for the same references and that sort of thing.
Well,
and so you had this era before that, before the rules were set in, where people were getting a little wilder and crazier.
There's that, and I guess third edition though was more about like Lockwood came in and Reynolds, and they made it kind of more about the anatomy, like especially Lockwood. Like, he always talks about that. Like, when he was drawing dragons, is like, how does this thing work? How do you, and he completely like changed the anatomical structures.
Yeah, and I don't want to be mean to Lockwood, but so Lockwood said, you need to think about anatomy. By anatomy, everyone has to look like the Matthew Broderick Godzilla movie.
Yeah.
So all of his dragons look like Matthew Broderick's Godzilla dragons. Like, you go before that, the Parkinson and the Elmore, Caldwell, Easton era dragons, or it could be sleek. They could have different kinds of shiny scales. They didn't have to have those giant chins. They didn't always have the spiky bits. They often had them, but modern dragons, they all have the spiky bits everywhere.
More spiky bits. Do you have a favorite piece?
A favorite piece? Of what era?
Pick one. I don't know. It's your favorite.
Oh, I mean, I promised that would be nice, but I'm going to still rag on this. I am mad that D&D 3rd edition, the 3.0 release, has Tony DiTerlizzi and Larry Elmore monster art in the Monster Manual 3.0. And then when they re-released them as 3.5, they took out the DiTerlizzi art and Elmore art and replaced them with the more generic kind of art.
I didn't even realize that.
They took out DiTerlizzi.
Yeah, I mean, Parks is talking about Brahm from Zeta, but Brahm for Dark Sun made Dark Sun iconic, and Tony DiTerlizzi did the same exact thing with Planescape. Yeah,
Planescape would not look nearly as good if it was like, people talk about how great those are, but you don't see a lot. I mean, that's why I was talking about MMOs, like Final Fantasy. The people who make Final Fantasy 14 Realm Reborn, they're very aggressive about making theirs look, very unique and a different kind of vision. And yeah, a lot of the times it's this weird thing of managed expectations. Nothing against the artists that they're hiring. Like this is where I'm an art director. I could get into like the aspects of art director. It's like that's what they're being told to draw, and that's what's being put in there. And it's not. I mean, a big thing, I can't link to it right here, but like if you look at the EverQuest games, like the first EverQuest video game, which was Parkinson's cover, and later got Elmore. You look at EverQuest 1, and then you look at the concept art for EverQuest 3, which never came out, EverQuest Next, because they took the EverQuest 1 concept art and redid it in the third style. You can see the big changes. The big change that always stands out to me is they got rid of all the pockets. If you look at 80s or 90s D&D artwork, people look like they had jobs. They have backpacks, they have pockets, they have belts, they have pouches. They look like they wander around with loot and gear. Modern characters look like they wander off of a video game. So they have the big giant axe or the wizard staff and nothing else. Swords are held on by magnets. And nothing against you if you like that, but like that shows that they went from something that looked like, workaday kind of stuff into fantasy based off other fantasy.
A little more functional.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's a style, but it was like people come into fantasy with some expectations of what they want it to be like a little familiar, and that's why I say I like to see stuff that looks a little bit different. Like with Myriad Song, we want to do a sci-fi that was very like post-colonial industrial of people repurposing stuff. So there's lots of big pipes and and heavy stuff and venting of steam and flame from reactors that are way more powerful than what we've repurposed them for. We wanted it to look like that gritty. We want a specific aesthetic to it, rather than just whatever generic fantasy is. I think a lot of these, a lot of these books, they just tell the artist to draw whatever.
Can you tell me about Madcap?
Madcap is a screwball comedy. Spencer Rydell came to us with the idea of doing a cartoon role-playing game. And this gets a lot into what I was calling performative role-play earlier, or we call it on our podcast. The idea that, okay, well, I'm trying to entertain other people at the table. And so the theory behind Madcap was you're a cartoon character. You're like an Animaniac or a Looney Tune or the Mickey Mouse reboot. You're a silly cartoon character, and you're going to interact with other cartoon characters. So a lot of the stuff that a lot of role-playing games try to like challenge you by trying to kill you, which is an issue we have recently, which is you can't kill SpongeBob. Okay, like we know he's not going to be dead. There's another episode coming up. And that's not why we came to watch. We wanted to see what wacky thing is going to happen. And so we had to find ways to challenge players. And one of the really cool ideas that Spencer had with the book was the idea of the grudge, which is you're not allowed to violently confront someone. You're not allowed to punch them or use any cool combat moves you get in the game first. But you can annoy the hell out of other people until they are so sick of you that they try to use violence against you. And so that's sort of like the vibe that goes on in the game of, can you be so annoying to non-player characters that they eventually start a grudge match with you?
Yeah, is that role playing, or are there mechanics for being annoying?
It's interesting you say that, because we spent a lot of time in the book talking about how improv comedy actually works. Like if you've been to beginner improv workshops, always say like, don't deny, but build. Yes. And like, if you say like, I'm the greatest fighter in the world, then it's kind of like, yeah, I saw, you would say, yeah, I saw you perform. The mayor declared your last boxing match a national tragedy, the day of mourning. So you did see that. I mean, that's how like improv comedy works. And so that's technically a rule, of working with other people and building on what they say, and also story beats, keeping the story moving. Those are technically rules, because those are things that a good director knows how to do. But you wouldn't think of them as game mechanics, because they're not roll 2 dice and add this number. Yeah. I mean, that's where we had the grudge matches of, if you're playing like a Lummox or a Bruiser, and it would say, okay, roll 2 dice, add your might to this and you can punch people, or roll 2 dice and add your cool and you can dodge out of the way. We did have that later, but a lot of the talk that we put in the game was, you want to like have a 3-act structure. So you want to start with this, you want to escalate tension, and there are rules to that per se. And that was one of the fun parts of working on the game, because that's building the challenge. That's the kind of stuff that's going on Critical Role and Dimension 20 and those shows. Those actors and the director know those rules and are using them, and we were excited to be able to put that in a gaming context and bring that to the table.
Now, you had also mentioned streams. So are you appearing on some streams?
I am a regular on twitch.tv/RAKTUS, Ractus, where we've done several games. Most recently, in fact, tomorrow we have an Ironclaw game scheduled. Yeah, we stream stuff, a whole bunch of stuff. There's a whole bunch of stuff in the archives. Gazillion Ironclaw games, Mutants and Masterminds, Blades in the Dark, a lot of stuff.
Nice. So do you have any home games going on?
I don't know why I paused there. Right now, everything we're doing is streaming. We do play tests every now and then that we don't stream. I am a working designer. It's kind of like the stream games are the ones that I'm playing for fun. But that's been pretty crazy.
Yeah. When is the last time you've played a game for fun that hasn't been streamed?
Let's see. It's 2021. When did COVID start?
Back in. Yeah.
There's if some people who come to the stream might say, hey, how come Sanguine's late on everything? It's like there's stuff going on, not just COVID stuff. This going on. I wish everybody gets through it all right, but I wish 2020 would end.
Someday it will. Eventually the calendar will just skip. I'll go 2019, 2022, or 2023, whatever it ends up being. I'll be like, what happened? We don't talk about that. For sure. Nah, I mean, I know a lot of people that like, especially streamers, right? They don't play unless it's being broadcast. And I've also gone through like phases where it's been like that, where we've all like we're playing, we're recording, or streaming. And we got to a certain point where we're just like, we're not gonna do that nearly as much. Like we have some stream games. We also like to try and keep at least a few for us to just have fun with and kind of kick back. I highly recommend it for anyone, but it can be tough with like, time constraints and adulting.
Yes. Role-playing games are often very much a youth market because it's people who have more leisure time have the ability to do this. That's why I caution folks who are designing stuff. It's like if you're designing stuff for old school revival crowd, you're designing it for last year. This year's generation, they're the ones who are talking about how great Critical Role is. They want something like Critical Role.
So with that in mind, like I guess Critical Role has been around since I think 2015.
Yeah.
Like has that changed your design, your game design perspective?
Definitely. Like our old design theory back in the 90s, our old design theory was we wanted to write games for two kinds of players: the casual player who just wants to come up and have fun, and the hardcore player who really wants to get into the crunchy rules. And we said the game's got to be designed so a casual player can just sit there and level up. They don't have to worry about anything. They can just, cat mercenary level 1, cat mercenary level 2, mercenary, just level up and just sit there and have fun. And if the crunchy player wants to go ahead and buy whirlwind attack and master all these abilities and stack this with that so I can go ahead and pull off an 8-hit combo, the two of them could still be competitive at the same table. And that morphed around the internet era into where we had to come up with another player type that I'm a little worried about, the wording, the try-hard player. This was the person who reads the internet and makes sure that this challenge rating, all the treasure drops are the same, and to make sure you don't do any trap builds, because we heard, that designers put abilities in Dungeons and Dragons and Pathfinder that were deliberately bad and punish you for taking them. Real stuff I've heard. So, I'm not saying I'm just saying this is what we heard. The tryhard started showing up and started yelling at people for playing the game wrong.
Yeah.
And we had to figure out how to adapt around that. kind of person, because that kind of person would yell at casuals for playing the game wrong. And so we started to put in advice of, if you're a GM, your job's not to kill the players, so you have to convince them that. And now in this era, we're dealing with what I would call the performative player, like which is, like a lot of gold GMing advice would say that funneling or railroading the players might be bad. Like if players go to this scene and then there's a fight, and then they go to the next scene to talk to the next informant, get to the next one, and there's a fight, that all the players are doing is walking from fight to fight. They're not having a lot of free will, decision process. There's a lot of published adventures like that are very linear. And, as a player, I get frustrated if nothing really matters. Even though they tell me I can be any character I want, we're just going to go to the next scene anyway and get in a fight with these guys anyway. When we go to meet the king, he's going to agree to everything we say because the adventure scripted that he agrees with everything. There's nothing we can do to derail that, or we don't have to pass the influence, etc. I used to talk about that as being bad, but now I'm wondering about the performative aspect of this. Now, when you watch a show like Critical Role, and people are going to fill the comments saying Critical Role is not linear, but a lot of it is that the players of those tables are aggressively trying to be entertaining and interesting in the situation that's presented to them. That they're looking at this as like an actor might look at this when a director presents a challenge to them. That their goal is to throw themselves into the scene and do the scene as well as they can. They're not necessarily worried about some sort of emergence that their own ideas or their own springboards might spring off from that. They're more worried about like being entertaining and being cool and awesome in the scene that they're in. And if you start looking at games with that sort of performative level, where the players are coming into it expecting to be that kind of stuff, that's an interesting way of looking at it. And that puts a lot of some of this other stuff into perspective. And so that's something we have to answer for ourselves as a question, because once again, this is the big thing. If you sell people the idea, if the rule book says you can do whatever you want, try anything, it's, you're do whatever your imagination, but then people go watch Critical Role, it's like, well, no, these are professional actors who are paid to be this certain kind of role and do this certain kind of thing in a certain amount of time. They're, doing a role and doing it well under direction. That's not the same thing that what the book is selling them. And so now we have to decide, like, can we fuse these? What do we keep? What do we lose? That's the challenge of role playing in the future.
So I don't know if my experience is unique, but I first saw the start of the performative player about 20 years ago. And the reason for it, what happened was, like, I've played since my tweens, and I've kind of always played, but I hit a certain point where my friends began aging out of the game. They started becoming adults and doing adult things instead. And I still wanted to play. So I started recruiting younger players. My partner in Nerdarchy, Ted, is a few years younger than me. My youngest brother is 8 years younger than me. So what that meant was that we started drawing players from high school and college. And we started seeing the theater kids interjected into the game. And which completely changed our table. And for a while, and we've had all kinds of different players, and then as those people got older, they kind of phased out and went away, as we just started playing with older people more. So, and then I kind of forgot about it and never thought about it again. But it only makes sense because now those people, the people that I call the theater kids, are now professionals, and some of them made it to professionals in those fields. So we're seeing it more in pop culture come up. We're seeing, some of those any one of those kids could be, a member of Critical Role, that that's kept playing or came back to the hobby. So I find it interesting that now it has more of a broader audience and more people are seeing that, because I feel like a lot of people that played for a long time, like they might be playing with the same group. So they didn't really see it because they didn't get new players. It was just like the same people that kind of stuck together.
Oh yeah, like definitely. Like I've run into people saying, well, on one of our design mantras is the problem that you're not having is not a problem. which you're seeing that like in
Yeah.
discourse about like gaming inclusivity and that sort of thing. Like, we never had a problem with this. Well, yeah, but most people don't get outside their comfort zone. And no, you're see that's what we approached. Like, Madcap has a sidebar in it that explains improv acting, but that's where, like, when folks were talking about the Mercer effect came from. Those theater kids came to it and said, well, I'm supposed to play a role, so I'll take the experience of the acting training that I know and apply
Yeah.
that to the role. And that's different from, if Rafferty shows up at your table, I'm ready to have a rules argument because I built my entire character around this set of rules and I'm ready to use them. And the performative people are going to say, well, you're not being interesting, to stop that.
Yeah.
And some old school fiat gamers saying, well, I think that's imbalanced and I can just declare that's null and void, so I won't do that. And the people who sold me the rules would say, well, sorry, I know we sold you a $50 rule book, but we're not using it. And so those are the kinds of people who go off and play EVE Online or Terra Online or whatever. Those, they wander off to go play computer games because no one gives them any grief about their builds there. But yeah, it's like you're absolutely right. And I think that the role-playing games need to stop talking about the good players and talking about your players. Like, I mean, you're going to have rules arguments. One of the things I'm very proud of is in our far-flung role-playing game, we have example of play. And some people comment on the example of play, hey, you introduced one player, but they don't say anything for the entire 8-page run until the very end, where the game master asks them, hey, I noticed you didn't say anything during the entire game.
Yeah.
And I wrote that in deliberately because that's the kind of player I see at the table. It's like you invited someone to play the role-playing game. They didn't know what it was. They felt kind of scared by everything and kind of said there's a wallflower. And like, that's the kind of thing I want to see an example of play. Every time I see examples of plays in books, they're always perfect players who know all the rules and do everything right. And like, that's not what's going to be at your table. The purpose of the book, the purpose of a role-playing game is so we can all get along.
I actually love that because we've talked about often. There's sometimes there's just that one player that sometimes it's not even that they're new or they don't know the rules. They are just a wallflower, and you check in with them and they're having fun and they enjoy it, but you can't tell because they don't really, they interact when when they're needed to interact, but they just like being there, and that's okay too, right? Like there's all kinds of different people.
You need to get the event. Like, people don't talk about the silent people who came in and came out. Like when people say like everyone I know like this, is like, yeah, but what about that one person who showed up at the game, didn't really talk to anybody and left? Why did they leave? And like, people go, well, I don't remember. We didn't really talk to them or engage or do anything. It's like, what happened? Now, as a player group, that could be fine, but as a game designer, as a person who presents an experience, we have to ask, what happened that didn't get this person involved, or when someone had a rules argument, why did they have that sort of thing. That's what I worry about performative, because like the professional actors and stuff, they're not there for dead air. They're not going to do things that game players would do. They're not going to fight with the GM over a rules interpretation. They're not going to get upset that they were building their character a certain way and now it doesn't work. That's, they're performative. They're there to be entertaining. And if something's getting in the way of that, they will roll with it because that's what they expect. But that's not what everyone else expects. And that's why we have to make some decisions about what is the game about. And if it's about certain things, then we have to talk about them. I think D&D 3rd edition did a lot of inroads where I think it was it's definitely the first edition of D&D to give you the straight dope and talk to you like what your players would actually do. But I worry that many games have gotten away from that and only talk about perfect players and blaming yourselves if it's no fun.
Yeah, I also always see like way too much emphasis put on the GM, which annoys me to no end. Like when there's a problem in the game, it's not a problem in the game. It's a problem in the social environment, and for some reason, the GM has to be the person to step in and arbitrate. And I'm like, the GM is just another player at the table. They may have a different role, but I don't think that inherently makes them better equipped or necessarily have to be the person to solve disputes or figure out if a player is being an a-hole at the table. They have to be the hammer. Like, you're all playing together. So like, these are things where any one of you could speak up and say something, or all of you could collectively.
Oh
Why is
yeah,
it just
no,
one person's job?
yeah, no. In all of our role playing games, including the original Ironclaw, we built in a debriefing session where we say at the end of the game, just have 5 minutes to ask everybody how the game went. Doesn't have to be a big deal. Just ask them, hey, did we do anything you didn't understand? Are you upset by anything? That kind of thing. I mean, and we just built it like people, some people are a little surprised by that. It's like, do we really have to do 5 minutes?
Yeah.
You don't necessarily do 5 minutes, but just ask. If you don't ask, you don't know. That's why I say, like, everybody at the game had fun except for the 80% who turned over. But uh, yeah, I think one fascinating thing I'm finding is the rise of GM-less games. Like the idea that can we play a game without a GM? And I think what you just said about why does the GM have to be bad dad here? Why do they have to be the referee for all the kind of stuff? And it's like, well, the game invested in the game master the authority of fiat. Only the GM is allowed to break the rules. They're allowed to have NPCs just die because it's dramatic, or they could just have more NPCs magically show up. They're allowed to create entire nations. They can change the numbers. They draw the battlefield. Players don't draw the battlefield. The GM does. So the GM is invested with a large amount of authority. And with that authority is supposed to come the idea that they can also arbitrate disputes, because the players only are allowed to control the player object and what the rules are. The players aren't allowed to make up, huge swaths of the world. Some people will say, well, yeah, in some games they are. Well, in some games, yeah, and I agree with you, but most people's experience, Dungeons and Dragons, Vampire Traveler, these are very rigidly defined of what the player is allowed to do. They're not the game master. Game master is allowed to do anything they want. And that's why they put a lot of effort in the GM. So I agree with you that I'd like to see the games being a little more mature. We need to give the players more authority to alter the world, but we also need to have players like learn respect, for what's going on. And I think like a lot of, I opened all of this by saying, I'm tired of blaming the GM when everything goes wrong.
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, it's not that there aren't bad GMs out there, but there are things you can put in the game that make it like toxic. Like the entire idea of Dungeons and Dragons is the GM is constantly trying to kill you, and that undercurrent still permeates the game.
So Brian wants to know, and I'd love to hear your response to this, being an indie guy now and having your own games. How appropriate is D&D 5e's as a noob's first experience in the hobby?
It's more appropriate than previous versions of the game, so I'll say that. But I don't. I personally have issues with like D&D 5 is not very well written. I'm just going to say that right now. Like the rules for bonus actions don't appear till page 160, paragraph 3. When we get back to what I love, every now and then I go back and reread the basic set, the mold base set I started with. And the way that started was you started at level 1. They only had, they had one class. You picked that and you were this. And then slowly when you leveled up, they introduced new abilities. And one problem I have with D&D 5 is they give you a bunch of special abilities. Here's your background. Here are skills. Here's your special class ability. When you get to level 3, level 2 if you're druid, you get special abilities again. Boom, take all this stuff. And like that's just in the first 2 or 3 levels. This game lasts for 20. So in many ways, I don't think it's a very good introduction. I mean, some people are surprised that Call of Cthulhu is extremely popular as a role-playing game. That's because Call of Cthulhu says, okay, you play a normal person, like a student or an athlete or a criminal. Here's how you model that in the game. Be a normal person. Or like, Chronicles of Darkness. Here's a normal person. Here's how you model it in the game. If you were a normal person, your job would be this wealth status. Here are the skills. People can get into that pretty easily. And like even fantasy games like Dungeon World simplify it a lot more, where Dungeon World says, here's your sheet. You can do what's on this sheet. That's it. Here's 10 abilities, check one of them off, and that's the one you've got. And it gets people in there like very easily. Like I mean, D&D 5 could be even simpler. That said, every game says you can do whatever the hell you want. So just put D&D 5 in front of them and tell them you're playing that.
Yeah. They won't know the difference. Now, I mean, we're huge D&D heads, and that's always like our go-to game at the end of the day. But I've always said like, it is not nearly the simplest game someone could learn, right? Like Powered by Apocalypse, almost anything is so much easier to put in front of a new player, where you can sit down with them and be like, "Hey, just check some boxes here. You have a character. Roll these
I
two
can't,
dice."
yeah, I can't get over the permadeath. I can't get over how D&D 5 gives you a character with 6 or 8 starting hit points, and monsters show up that can do 2 dice in a single hit, or 8 kobolds that all do 1d4 plus 3. It's like I can't get over how deadly the game is at early levels. Like no computer game is like that. World of Warcraft does not kill you in the tutorial area.
And the fact of the matter is, it's better than the previous editions.
I have a fondness for D&D 4. I could go on and on and on about how I think D&D 4 was a step in the right direction, and I think D&D 5 is an overreaction to it.
Well, that could be very well. I have always enjoyed pulling, but when we were like going and dissecting 5e when it was new, like I loved pulling out all the 4e isms that make 5e a better game. Because like I didn't have a visceral reaction to 4e. I just felt like everything felt very same. So after a while, I got a little bored with it.
I think the issue with 4E is that 4E was combat. So 4E loved combat and invested everything in combat. And a lot of people were saying, I don't come to D&D for the combat. And I would say, yes, that's fine. It'd be great to do other things. But D&D 5 doesn't answer that. D&D 5 simplifies the combat, but still has weird abilities. Like instead of encounters and dailies, they have short rests and long rests.
Yeah.
Carries into a lot of stuff there. And D&D 5 is still very combat oriented. They still have a lot of combat powers. They brought back charm person, so you can just blast people and do whatever, now you'll just agree with whatever I say. They got back to the linear type of storytelling and blasting things. People are probably filling the comments saying, well, you can do other things with it. Yeah, but those are kind of like add-ons. It's still, here's the monster manual with all the monsters ranked by challenge rating and all the monsters clearly labeled evil so you can kill them. Not to mention, like, D&D 5 is creepy. Like, there's that creepy text in there that says, all orcs have within them the capacity for evil. Evil is an inherent quality that is built within the genetics of several races in the book. And, like, people are starting to call out, like that's new to D&D 5, guys. That was not in previous versions of the game. And people are starting to call the game out for being, like, very creepy and reductive like that. And I think they're right to do it.
So circling back to the original question of for new players, what is the best Sanguine Games for a new player?
Oh, geez, the best Sanguine game for new players. I gotta be honest with you, the Powered by the Apocalypse games, especially stuff like Madcap, are easy to get into because they're very, very simple. But that said, Madcap is a cartoon silly game, and a lot of people didn't necessarily come to the table to be silly. And Farflung is a high concept mature game that was done very simple for the purpose of being because we wanted mature issues with it. So we didn't want the rules. We didn't want to have 200 pages of combat if we're going to talk about things, like social relationships, and power dynamics and that sort of thing. We didn't want to get in the way. It's not what people are expecting. I would suggest Urban Jungle is our friendliest game to newbies because it's complicated enough that you can do stuff with it. It's set in like a DuckTales type universe. So if you've seen DuckTales, it's like that. Backbone is out. Black Sad is a video game. If you've seen any of those, it's like those. So that would be easier for you to get into. And it's crunchy enough to be what you expect out of a role-playing game, while also being accessible enough. And, because we learn as we go. We read our games to be accessible.
I kind of want to check out Madcap now and run a classic D&D game with it.
There is a sidebar. We presented a couple silly things, but we also presented like fantasy, like if you wanted to be.
Yeah. I just think it would be kind of hilarious to take the D&D trope. Because D&D is essentially its own trope and run it through the lens of a cartoon world.
We really went. There's a little sidebar of dragons, which I was like, I've been to the Wormkin on the Nye. Which there's a whole sidebar of how cool dragons are in there because dragons are cool.
Nice.
So yeah, you could easily do it. I'm also shout out John Kovalik, who was one of our earlier boosters. So he did silly stuff like Dork Tower and Serendipity. So
yeah, that's some good stuff.
I think But Madcap is very similar. Urban Jungle, I think, is that right level. It's especially because like one thing that's games will talk about being, it's this weird thing where games will talk about they're not about combat, but people like to see action movies. People
Yeah.
like don't say, "Oh, my favorite parts of Star Wars were the Senate floor scenes. Those are my favorite." Like no one says that, you know. So one of our goals in some of our games was to have characters who participate in action scenes, but not necessarily combat. Urban Jungle and Ironclaw and the rest of them have abilities in them like pacifist or non-combat or or coward, where you get bonuses to your defenses in certain situations if you are never violent or if you're running away. You know, like so you could still participate in those fights, like be in a fight scene, but no one expects you to fight because you have specific buffs if you're not fighting or if you're fleeing. So people can still show up and shoot at you, but you still have abilities to deal with that. And that's a big deal because almost every other role-playing game I see doesn't do that. If you want to play a non-combatant in D&D, they don't give you bonuses to your armor class or reaction rolls or charisma or anything for not fighting. They just tell, if you build a non-combatant, you just build a character that sucks.
Ouch. But yes. So, all that being said, links are in the description for Sanguine Games. Go check them out. We're just past the hour mark, so it is time to wrap things up. Final thoughts before we head out, Norman?
Um, www.sanguinegames.com. Also, twitch.tv/RAKTUS Ractus. We stream games. We are once again on tour doing our How to Self-Publish. So support your local indie. And thanks again for your support. Enjoy the present while we hope for the future.
Thanks for coming on. I really appreciate it. And until next time, everyone, stay nerdy.